In the early months of 1940, Europe was slipping into darkness. Nation after nation had fallen to the relentless advance of Nazi Germany, whose armies and aircraft seemed unstoppable. Poland had collapsed within weeks. Norway and Denmark followed, and in May and June, the world watched in shock as France, long considered one of the strongest powers in Europe, was crushed with terrifying speed. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped through the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and the sense of a narrow, almost miraculous survival. For Britain, an island nation that had always relied on the sea for protection, the threat now came not from battleships, but from the sky. Across the English Channel, just 20 miles away, the Luftwaffe massed in overwhelming numbers. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, and crews hardened by months of victory. Germany had conquered everything from Warsaw to Paris. Britain was next. And yet, beneath the looming threat, something else took shape. A determination, quiet but unwavering, that the island would not fall. Not if its defenders could help it. This chapter opens not with battles, but with the slow rising tension of a country preparing for an air war, unlike anything the world had ever seen. A nation on edge. In the summer of 1940, the streets of London buzzed with a strange mixture of fear and routine. Blackout curtains covered every window. Air raid wardens patrolled the streets at night, ensuring even the smallest glimmer of light was extinguished. Gas masks were issued, trenches dug in parks, and millions of civilians braced themselves for the storm they knew was coming. But the most critical preparations happened far from the public eye, inside the Royal Air Force. Fighter Command, led by the brilliant and uncompromising Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had spent the previous years quietly building the system that would soon defend Britain. It wasn't just aircraft. It wasn't just pilots. It was a complete and integrated web of radar towers, observers, radio networks, control rooms, and fighter squadrons, all working together in a way no country had ever attempted before. This was the Dowding system, and it would become the backbone of Britain's survival. The young men who would defend the skies inside RAF airfields across the south of England. Hundreds of young men trained daily. Most of them were barely out of school, 19, 20, 21 years old. Yet within weeks, they would face combat against the Luftwaffe's experienced aces. They came from every corner of Britain. Farm boys from Yorkshire, bank clerks from London, apprentices, mechanics, university students. Some had flown for only a few dozen hours before being sent to operational squadrons. Many had never fired a shot in anger. And yet, they were the ones who stood between Britain and defeat. Their instructors pushed them relentlessly. They practiced formation flying at dawn, gunnery at midday, and emergency procedures until sunset. Mistakes were corrected on the spot. Hesitation was not tolerated. The sky, they were told, would not forgive them. But what truly set the RAF apart was not just its pilots, it was its diversity. When war came, volunteers arrived not just from Britain, but from across the Commonwealth and beyond. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Irishmen, and dozens of others arrived to join the fight. Many had traveled thousands of miles to protect a country they had never seen. Polish and Czech pilots, who had already fought and lost in their own homelands, arrived burning with a desire for revenge. Their skill and aggression would soon become legendary. Together, these men formed a patchwork of accents, backgrounds, and stories, united by a single mission: defend the sky. The machines, Spitfires, Hurricanes, and the future of air combat. While the pilots trained, Britain's factories worked day and night to produce the fighters that would carry them into battle. The two aircraft that defined Britain's air war could not have been more different. The Hawker Hurricane was rugged, reliable, and forgiving. Built with older methods fabric over a metal frame, it was easy to repair and capable of absorbing a remarkable amount of damage. It would shoot down more enemy aircraft than any other British fighter during the battle. The Supermarine Spitfire, by contrast, was something new entirely. Sleek, aerodynamic, almost futuristic in appearance, the Spitfire captured the imagination of everyone who saw it. Its elliptical wings gave it unmatched maneuverability, and its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine delivered astonishing speed. It was the fighter every pilot wanted to fly. Together, the Hurricane and Spitfire created a perfect balance. One specialized in tearing apart bomber formations, while the other matched the Luftwaffe's Bf-109 in the swirling high-altitude dogfights. Still, Britain was dangerously outnumbered. The Luftwaffe could field thousands of aircraft. The RAF had only a fraction of that number. Every fighter mattered. Every pilot mattered even more. The secret weapon, radar. But Britain had something Germany lacked, something invisible yet transformative: radar. Along the coastline stood tall towers, each sending out radio pulses that bounced off incoming aircraft. The echoes returned to operators in dark, humming control rooms, who translated the signals into precise information: altitude, speed, direction, numbers. In an era when most countries still relied on observers with binoculars, Britain could now detect enemy formations while they were still forming over France. This allowed Fighter Command to direct its squadrons with remarkable efficiency, scrambling only the aircraft needed and sending them exactly where they would make the greatest impact. To the Luftwaffe, this advantage was a mystery. They could not understand how the RAF always seemed to be waiting for them. The calm before the storm. By late June 1940, the stage was set. Hitler's armies controlled Europe. France had fallen. The British Army, though alive, was battered. The Royal Navy was strong, but could not stop bombers. The Luftwaffe gathered strength across the Channel, filling airfields from Normandy to Belgium. Britain was alone, but not defeated. Not yet. Inside the operations room at RAF Fighter Command headquarters in Bentley Priory, the large plotting table glowed softly under the lights. WAF officers moved colored blocks across it, representing squadrons, enemy raids, and radar contacts. Controllers watched from the balcony, ready to make decisions that could change the fate of the nation. Pilots waited in dispersal huts, drinking tea, playing cards, trying not to think about what was coming. Ground crews checked every bolt, wire, and engine, knowing a pilot's life depended on their hands. Everyone felt it: the tension, the anticipation, the certainty that the next chapter in Britain's history would be written not on land, but in the sky. And soon, very soon, the Luftwaffe would make its move. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Dawn came quietly over the English Channel, casting a pale golden light on the surface of the water. Fishing boats moved slowly through the mist, unaware that high above them, the first sparks of what would become a full inferno were beginning to form. The summer of 1940 would not remain calm for long. The Luftwaffe was probing Britain's defenses, searching for weaknesses, testing reactions and measuring the strength of the Royal Air Force. These early clashes were small by comparison to the massive raids that would follow, but they were crucial. They were the first opening moves in a game where mistakes were paid in blood, and where every pilot learned very quickly that survival depended on instinct, training, and luck. It was during these first encounters that Britain's young pilots truly understood what lay ahead. Scramble, the call that changed everything. It often began with a sudden ring of a telephone in the dispersal hut. Pilots, lounging in deck chairs or playing cards, would freeze. A controller's voice would come through, sharp and urgent. "Scramble! Scramble!" In an instant, everything exploded into motion. Chairs toppled, mugs of tea spilled. Pilots sprinted across the grass toward their aircraft, adrenaline surging. Engine starters whined, propellers roared to life, and within seconds, Spitfires and Hurricanes were lifting off the ground, climbing steeply into the sky. For many pilots, the first scramble was the moment the reality of war became absolutely clear. One moment you were joking with friends. The next, you were climbing at full throttle toward a formation of enemy aircraft that could kill you without ever seeing your face. These early scrambles were often triggered by small formations, reconnaissance aircraft, lone bombers, or small fighter patrols. The Luftwaffe was testing the RAF's reaction time, checking how quickly radar stations could track them and how efficiently airfields responded. They learned something important. Britain was always ready. Meeting the enemy. The first time a young British pilot saw a German aircraft up close, the moment stayed with him forever. "There they are," his section leader would say, pointing toward faint specks glinting in the sunlight. A second later, the radio would crackle. "Tally-ho! Enemy aircraft ahead! Attack!" And then everything happened at once. The quiet hum of flight transformed into a roar of engines as throttles pushed forward. Air rushed violently around the cockpit, the sky filled with movement fighters twisting, diving, climbing, and circling like sparks thrown into the wind. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was fast, agile, and flown by pilots who had spent months perfecting their combat skills over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Many had dozens of victories to their names. They were confident. Some even believed the RAF was too weak to pose a real threat. The Spitfire proved them wrong. With its tight, turning circle and powerful Merlin engine, it could match the Bf-109 in almost every maneuver. Dogfights became swirling dances of death, where a single mistake meant disaster. A pilot who looked over his shoulder at the wrong time, or who flew straight for too long, could suddenly find tracer bullets ripping past his cockpit. And in those first battles, the RAF learned two hard truths. The enemy was better trained, but Britain's pilots were more determined. Trial by fire. Every new pilot faced a moment of truth, the first time he squeezed the trigger. The Spitfire's 8 Browning machine guns fired together, sending streams of bullets into the sky. But hitting a moving target at 300 miles per hour in a turning fight with your aircraft shaking violently, it was far harder than training suggested. Many pilots returned from their first mission shaken. Some had been attacked without ever seeing the enemy. Others watched their friends fall in flames. A few returned with bullet holes in their wings, wondering how they were still alive. But each encounter taught them something. They learned to trust their instincts. They learned never to fly straight for more than a few seconds. They learned to scan the sky constantly, above, behind, to the side. And they learned to respect the enemy. These early clashes were not decisive, but they were transformative. Fighter Command's young pilots became hardened faster than anyone expected. Their confidence grew, their reflexes sharpened, their teamwork improved. One pilot later wrote, "By the third or fourth sortie, you were either dead or you understood what to do." And the coastline becomes a battleground. The area over the Channel, especially the narrowest part between Dover and Calais, became known as Hellfire Corner. Here, Spitfires and Bf-109s clashed almost daily. Fishermen saw dogfights erupt above them, spiraling downward until aircraft skimmed the waves. Sometimes a fighter hit the water and vanished instantly. Other times a pilot bailed out, drifting into the sea while coastal rescue teams scrambled to save him. These skirmishes were the warm-up before the main act. Neither side yet committed their full strength. Instead, they tested, measured, and adapted. German reconnaissance aircraft tried to photograph radar stations. The fighters chased them off. Luftwaffe fighters probed deeper inland. RAF pilots pushed them back. Each small encounter strengthened Britain's resolve. The RAF was proving day by day that it would not break easily. Lessons learned in blood. The RAF discovered that the Bf-109 had advantages, especially at altitude. The German fighter climbed well and could disengage by diving toward France, where British fighters could not follow without risking fuel starvation. But the RAF had strengths of its own. Better communication. British pilots worked as a coordinated team through radio control. Radar advantage, they were rarely surprised. Home territory. A shot-down British pilot often lived to fight another day. A shot-down German pilot became a prisoner. Still, the cost was rising. Aircraft crashed into fields. Parachutes dotted the sky. Families received telegrams. Airfields held funerals. Ground crews painted new names on replacement aircraft. War was no longer an idea. It was now real and personal. The enemy takes notice. German commanders began to understand something important. This would not be France. The RAF fought with precision, courage, and organization. Radar made surprise nearly impossible. British pilots, though young, were fearless. The Luftwaffe had underestimated them. With every passing week, German raids increased in size and intensity. Reconnaissance reports showed more RAF fighters than expected. British squadrons seemed to appear from nowhere. Losses mounted not enough to change strategy, but enough to raise eyebrows in Berlin. Hitler grew impatient. Goering grew irritated, and the Luftwaffe began preparing for something much bigger. The probing was over. The real battle was about to begin. By mid-July 1940, the probing attacks were over. The Luftwaffe had gathered enough intelligence. They understood the rhythms of Britain's defenses, the pattern of radar stations, the response time of different sectors, and the performance of RAF fighters. Now came the next phase. Adler Tag, Eagle Day, the day Germany would launch its full offensive to crush the Royal Air Force and clear the skies for a future invasion of Britain. The battle that unfolded in the weeks that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Hundreds of aircraft clashed daily across southern England. Airfields burned, columns of smoke rose from the coast, and the once peaceful countryside became a vast arena where life and death hung on a few seconds of reaction time. This was the true beginning of the Battle of Britain. Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe unleashes its fury. On the morning of August 13th, 1940, radar screens lit up with an alarming number of contacts. Luftwaffe squadron's bombers, escorted by large formations of Bf-109s and Bf-110s, were heading across the channel in multiple waves. In the Fighter Command Operations Room, the plotting table filled with red markers representing the approaching enemy. WAF operators moved rapidly, updating the board in real time as the situation escalated. Multiple raids approaching from the southeast. Large formation detected over Calais. Possible bomber stream heading toward Southampton. Controllers gave the orders. Scramble! All squadrons scramble! Airfields erupted with sound. Spitfires and Hurricanes accelerated across grass runways, climbing into the morning sky. Ground crews shielded their faces from the wind blast, watching their pilots lift off to meet the oncoming storm. The Luftwaffe hit airfields first. RAF bases at Eastchurch, Kenley, and Detling were bombed heavily. Hangars collapsed in flames. Fuel stores detonated. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed before their pilots could even start their engines. Germany's strategy was clear. Destroy fighter command on the ground, overwhelm it in the air, and force Britain to its knees. Airfields under siege. These early days of the full assault were brutal. Airfields in the south became prime targets. Pilots returning from combat had to dodge falling bombs to land safely. Ground crews worked through the night repairing cratered runways and damaged aircraft. One mechanic later recalled, "We didn't sleep. We didn't stop. Planes came back full of holes. We patched them. Engines were coughing. We fixed them. The boys had to get back up there, even if the aircraft was held together with hope and safety wire. Pilots began flying 5, 6, sometimes 7 sorties a day. They fought until they were dehydrated, lightheaded, and on the brink of collapse. Many had no time to eat between missions. They would land, refuel, reload, and take off again within minutes. The pace was relentless, and the Luftwaffe intensified its attacks. They struck Portsmouth, Southampton, Dover, and numerous coastal bases. Explosions rocked the countryside. Smoke drifted for miles. And still RAF fighters rose to meet them. The sky becomes a furnace. The sky over Britain changed during these weeks. It became a chaotic, thunderous place, filled with contrails, black smoke, and the roar of engines. Dogfights erupted at every altitude. Bombers pressed forward while Hurricanes tore into their formations. Spitfires tangled with Bf-109s in deadly, twisting duels. The radio airwaves filled with frantic voices. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high. I've got one on my tail. Braking left. Where are they? I can't see them. I'm hit. I'm going down." For every pilot, the world narrowed to a bubble of noise and instinct. You scanned the sky constantly. You never flew straight. You fired only when certain. And you prayed that when flames burst from an enemy aircraft, it wasn't one of your own. Many German pilots were stunned by the ferocity they encountered. They expected a broken enemy. Instead, they found a wall of resistance, a test of systems, not just machines. While pilots fought in the air, the ground network supporting them worked flawlessly. Radar operators detected enemy formations early. Controllers analyzed the strength and direction of each raid. Squadrons were guided with remarkable precision to intercept bombers before they reached their targets. This was the Dowding system in full operation, the first fully integrated air defense network in world history. Hitler's commanders had never encountered anything like it. Their fighters were fast, their bombers powerful, but they could not hide. No matter how they attempted to deceive or change direction, radar exposed them. Again and again, German crews reported the same baffling problem. The RAF is always waiting for us. Courage under fire. Amid the chaos, individual acts of courage became the heartbeat of the battle. A young Hurricane pilot named Johnny Johnson once landed with his aircraft so badly damaged that the wings were shredded. He climbed out, dizzy from concussion, only to return minutes later asking if another aircraft was available. Another pilot, Richard Hillary, bailed out of his burning Spitfire after being hit in the face and hands. He parachuted into a field and survived, though barely because local farmers spotted him collapsing near a hedgerow. And then there were the ground crews, who kept fighting even as bombs fell around them. Many refused to run for shelter unless ordered. "If the pilots can face it in the air, we can face it on the ground," one said. These stories spread across Britain, strengthening the public's resolve. The toll begins to mount, but courage came at a terrible price. Crashed aircraft littered the countryside. Some pilots returned covered in oil and blood. Others didn't return at all. Squadron rosters changed daily. New faces appeared in dispersal huts, fresh, anxious, and painfully aware of the shoes they were filling. For the Luftwaffe, losses were high, too. Bombers struggled to reach targets without being mauled by hurricanes. Fighter escorts were forced to split between protecting bombers and engaging Spitfires. Morale began to slip, and commanders questioned Göring's strategies. Still, neither side backed down. The battle intensifies. By late August, the scale of the conflict reached new heights. The Luftwaffe launched coordinated multi-wave assaults involving hundreds of aircraft. The RAF responded with everything it had. From the chalk cliffs of Dover to the rolling fields of Kent, the sky became a battlefield from dawn until dusk. Villagers watched from their gardens as dogfights spiraled overhead. Children counted parachutes drifting down. Farmers found aircraft wreckage in their fields. This was no distant war. This was happening above their homes. Fighter command began to feel the strain. Aircraft reserves shrank. Pilots were exhausted. Controllers pushed units to the brink. Yet something remarkable happened. The RAF did not break. Even under overwhelming pressure, squadrons kept flying. Ground crews kept repairing. Radar towers kept scanning. Britain endured. The turning point approaches. Though battered and fatigued, the RAF was still alive. It had not been destroyed on the ground. Its fighters had not been swept from the sky. Germany had underestimated the resilience of both the system Dowding built and the young men who flew for it. The Luftwaffe leadership grew frustrated. Hitler grew impatient. Göring grew desperate for a decisive victory. And then, after weeks of assault, the Germans made a critical decision, one that would change the fate of the battle. They turned their attention toward London. The Blitz was about to begin, and the next chapter in Britain's air war would plunge both civilians and pilots into a new level of danger. As August drew to a close, the Luftwaffe's frustration began to boil over. Weeks of assault on RAF airfields had inflicted serious damage, but Britain's fighters stubbornly refused to collapse. The radar network continued to operate. Squadrons kept rising to intercept incoming raids, and though losses were heavy, the RAF remained intact. Hitler, increasingly irritated by the lack of progress, authorized a shift in Strategy 1 that would mark the beginning of a new and terrifying chapter in Britain's air war. On September 7, 1940, Shortly before 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the first great wave of bombers roared toward London. It was a formation so massive that eyewitnesses described the sky as black with aircraft. More than 300 bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, approached the Thames like an iron river in the sky. Londoners looked up in stunned disbelief as the armada passed overhead, its engines creating a deep, rolling thunder that echoed through the streets. Within minutes, the city was engulfed in fire. Explosions rippled across the docks of the East End, igniting warehouses, factories, and storage tanks. Flames leapt into the air, visible for miles. Smoke filled the sky, turning late afternoon into night. This was the beginning of the Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign that would last for months and leave scars on Britain that would remain for generations. For the German High Command, the logic seemed sound. By shifting attacks to London, they hoped to break civilian morale, cripple infrastructure, and force the RAF to defend the capital rather than its airfields. They believed this would stretch fighter command too thin and finally give the Luftwaffe the upper hand. What they did not expect was how this decision would galvanize British resistance and allow the RAF breathing room to recover, reorganize, and ultimately strengthen its position. But in the moment, none of that mattered to the people living through that first terrible night. The Thames became a path of fire. Buildings collapsed in showers of sparks. Fire brigades raced from one inferno to another, often arriving too late to save anything but the surrounding streets. Civilians huddled in basements, underground stations, and makeshift shelters, listening to the bombs whistle down, praying that the next one would not fall on them. Above them, RAF pilots fought desperate battles. Squadrons scrambled repeatedly, climbing through the thick, oily smoke that blanket the city. Hurricanes dove at bomber formations from above. Spitfires tangled with Bf-109s overhead, and tracer fire crisscrossed the sky. London's defenses roared to life. Anti-aircraft guns hammered the darkness, searchlights pierced the smoke, and the glow of fires illuminated the silhouettes of aircraft as they twisted and turned in combat. One pilot later described the scene as like flying into the mouth of hell. The heat rising from the burning city created violent updrafts that buffeted aircraft. Smoke stung the eyes and filled cockpits. Pilots had seconds to identify friend from foe in the flickering glow below them. And yet they fought on, driven by a fierce determination to protect the capital and its people. For Londoners, the first night of the Blitz was a baptism by fire. But it was also the beginning of something extraordinary, a spirit of defiance that would define the city. Even as fires raged, volunteers formed human chains to pass buckets of water. Firefighters battled blazes until they collapsed from exhaustion. Air raid wardens guided civilians through the darkness. Hospitals worked by candlelight after windows shattered and power lines fell. In one of the city's underground stations, a musician brought a violin and began to play to calm frightened children. Across the city, people supported one another with a quiet, stubborn courage that would become known as the Blitz spirit. Night after night, the Luftwaffe returned. For 57 consecutive days, London was bombed. The targets varied: railways, docks, warehouses, factories, but civilians always paid the heaviest price. Families slept in shelters or subway platforms. People woke each morning unsure if their homes would still be standing. Entire streets disappeared in explosions, replaced by smoking craters and the jagged remains of brick walls. Yet, despite the destruction, the city did not break. Trains continued to run. Shops reopened each morning. Children went to school when they could. Buses operated even as drivers had to navigate around fresh debris. Churchill visited bombed neighborhoods, walking among rubble, shaking hands with survivors, telling them, "We can take it." His presence strengthened morale, but so did the determination of ordinary people who refused to let fear control their lives. Above them, the air war intensified. The RAF was forced to take off in poor visibility, fight low over the city, and intercept bombers coming in waves throughout the night. Pilots flew until exhaustion blurred their vision. Some fell asleep in their cockpits on the return flight home. Ground crews, equally fatigued, worked under blackout conditions with hand lamps, patching bullet holes and fitting new engines so that fighters could return to the air within hours. But even as Britain endured the nightly terror of the Blitz, something crucial was happening. The Luftwaffe was slowly losing momentum. Bombers struggled to hit precise targets in the darkness. Fighter escorts had limited range and were often forced to turn back, leaving bombers vulnerable. Radar continued to function. Fighter command remained intact, and with airfields no longer the primary targets, the RAF finally had the breathing room it desperately needed. This shift in strategy proved to be one of Germany's greatest strategic mistakes. While London burned, the RAF repaired runways, replaced aircraft, rotated exhausted squadrons, and reorganized its defenses. More pilots arrived from training units. Factories increased production. Dowding's system damaged but never broken began to recover. Meanwhile, German losses climbed. Bombers were shot down over the city night after night. Experienced crews were lost. Morale began to waver. The Blitz, intended to crush Britain, instead strengthened its resolve and weakened its enemy. By October, Londoners had settled into a grim routine. Nights were spent underground. Mornings were spent clearing rubble, repairing windows, and checking on neighbors. The city bore scars everywhere: charred buildings, shattered streets, the skeletal remains of churches and homes. And yet, through the smoke and destruction, life continued. The Blitz had become a symbol of endurance, a test of willpower that London met with extraordinary strength. But the air war was far from over. As autumn deepened and the Luftwaffe intensified its efforts to crush Britain once and for all, the battle reached its decisive moment, one that would determine not just the future of the RAF, but the fate of the entire nation. And that moment would arrive on a single, unforgettable day in September. September 15th, 1940 dawned cool and bright, with a crisp clarity that made the sky over southern England seem almost peaceful. But everyone inside RAF Fighter Command knew the truth. This would be the day. Intelligence reports, radio intercepts, and Luftwaffe patterns all pointed to a massive attack, one more attempt by Germany to crush Britain's defenses in a single decisive blow. At Bentley Priory, the nerve center of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding and Keith Park arrived early, both sensing what was coming. WAF plotters stood at their stations, waiting for radar screens to flicker to life. Ground crews at airfields across the southeast tightened bolts, checked fuel lines, wiped soot from gun ports, and waited for the sound they'd come to dread yet rely upon. The scramble bell. The pilots were tired, exhausted, even but ready. Many had flown consecutive missions for days, and some had slept in their flight gear to save precious minutes. No one said much that morning. They smoked, they sipped tea, they stared at maps. The tension hung over every dispersal hut like a fog. By late morning, radar stations along the coast detected multiple large formations assembling over France. The number of aircraft was staggering. Hundreds of bombers, escorted by an equal number of fighters, pouring into the sky like a steel tide. The largest raid yet. Over the operations table, the markers multiplied rapidly as controllers realized the scale of the oncoming assault. The room buzzed with urgency. Phones rang. Orders were shouted. For a moment, even the veteran officers felt the weight of what was happening. Then came the words that sent a jolt across southern England. Scramble all groups. Repeat, scramble all groups. Fighter Command launched almost every squadron it had. Hurricanes and Spitfires lifted off from airfields in waves, engines screaming as they climbed at full throttle. Pilots felt the familiar knot in their stomachs, the mixture of fear and adrenaline that came before every battle, but amplified now by the knowledge that this day could decide everything. As they climbed through the blue, the sky began to fill with aircraft, hundreds of RAF fighters rising to meet hundreds of enemy bombers and escorts. The pilots formed up, climbing to altitude, scanning the horizon. And then they saw them. A dark, sprawling mass stretching across miles of sky. The Luftwaffe's full strength heading directly for London. The radio crackled. "This is it, boys. Tally-ho!" The two forces collided with overwhelming force. Spitfires dove straight at the Bf-109 escort fighters, engaging them in tight, violent dogfights. The sky erupted into twisting trails of white contrails, black bursts of smoke, and flashes of gunfire. Hurricanes roared at the bomber stream, guns blazing. The air thundered with engines, explosions, and the rattle of machine gun fire. It was chaos pure, blinding chaos. Pilots had seconds to react, pulling G-forces that blurred their vision as they dodged tracer rounds. A Spitfire spiraled past, smoke pouring from its engine before the pilot bailed out in a flash of white parachute silk. A Hurricane fired point-blank into a Dornier, which burst into flames before breaking apart in mid-air. Everywhere, aircraft were spinning, diving, burning. Yet the RAF held firm. Squadron after squadron tore into the enemy. Controllers sent reinforcements with astonishing precision, guiding fighters into the battle exactly where they were needed. The Germans, expecting to overwhelm a weakened opponent, instead found themselves facing a coordinated, unbroken defense. The bomber crews felt the pressure immediately. Their formations, usually steady and disciplined, began to waver under the relentless attacks. Gunners fired wildly as hurricanes swooped in from every direction. Survivors later described it as flying through a storm of hornets. The assault on London continued, but it grew more disorganized. Groups of bombers broke formation, scattering under the onslaught. Smoke trailed behind damaged aircraft as they struggled toward their targets. And still the RAF came, from Biggin Hill, from Northolt, from Kenley, from Hornchurch. Fighters launched, fought, landed, refueled, rearmed, and returned to the sky. It seemed impossible, this endless stream of aircraft rising to meet the enemy, but Britain had reached deep into its reserves on this day. Every pilot, every machine that could fly was thrown into the battle. At one point, Churchill himself visited the Fighter Command bunker. He stood quietly behind the controllers, watching the table fill with markers showing dozens of enemy forces. As the RAF squadrons engaged raid after raid, he whispered to himself the now famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." But he did not say them lightly. He said them because he knew, everyone knew, that the few were all that stood between Britain and devastation. By early afternoon, the Luftwaffe launched a second massive wave, larger than the first. Once more, RAF fighters rose to meet it. The battle intensified, becoming one of the largest aerial engagements in history. Pilots ran out of ammunition, returned to base shaking with fatigue, and begged ground crews for another chance to go up. Some did. Others were physically pulled from their cockpits, too exhausted to continue. On the German side, confidence began to falter. Losses mounted. Escorts were dragged into dogfights far from the bombers they were meant to protect. Radio transmissions captured from German pilots revealed confusion, frustration, and disbelief. They could not understand how the RAF still had so many fighters left. They could not understand why the British resistance seemed to grow stronger as the day wore on. By late afternoon, the battle began to shift decisively. Bomber formations broke apart. Some turned back early. Others pushed on alone, only to be intercepted and torn apart. The Luftwaffe's strength, stretched to the limit, began to fray. When the final German aircraft retreated across the Channel, the sky over England fell suddenly quiet. Smoke drifted from the horizon. Parachutes hung in the air. The sun lowered, casting a golden glow over fields littered with debris and the remains of battle. Britain had survived the greatest aerial assault in its history. That evening, as reports came in, Fighter Command realized the magnitude of their achievement. The Luftwaffe had suffered enormous losses, unsustainable losses. Morale on the German side plummeted. Goering raged at his commanders, unable to accept what had happened. And across Britain, from London to the smallest village, people understood something profound. The tide had turned. The Battle of Britain was not over, but its outcome had been decided. The RAF had proved, beyond any doubt, that it could not be broken. On that single day, through fire, fear, and sheer willpower, Britain had fought back, and it had won. When the fury of the Luftwaffe finally subsided and the last of the great raids dwindled into isolated attacks, Britain emerged from the smoke battered but unbroken. The Battle of Britain had been won, not in a single stroke, not through overwhelming strength, but by the endurance, sacrifice, and sheer determination of a small group of young pilots who came to be known forever as the Few. As the autumn of 1940 deepened and the nights grew colder, the nation began to realize the scale of what had happened in its skies. Newspapers printed photographs of smiling airmen, their boots muddy from airfields, their jackets worn, their faces far younger than anyone expected of heroes. But there were other images, too. The empty chairs in squadron mess halls, the burned-out airfield huts, the wreckage dragged from fields where pilots had made their final descent. The victory was immense, but so, too, was the cost. Across Britain, people tried to understand who these young men were. These pilots who had risked everything, day after day, often with only minutes of warning before they were sent into battles that could end in seconds. Some were seasoned flyers, veterans of earlier campaigns. Many more were boys, scarcely trained, rushed from flying schools into cockpits because there was simply no time. They came from every corner of the British Isles, and from far beyond. There were Poles who had escaped the destruction of their homeland, flying with a ferocity born of grief and vengeance. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and South Africans. Commonwealth volunteers who crossed oceans to join the fight. Czechs and Slovaks who battled with heartbreaking intensity for a country they had lost. Americans who joined before their own nation entered the war. The Battle of Britain was not just a British victory, it was a human one, built by those who believed tyranny could not be allowed to win. In the months following the battle, when the roar of engines no longer shook the skies each morning, the surviving pilots tried to settle into something like normal life. Some returned to their squadrons, preparing for future missions. Others were quietly rotated into training roles, teaching the next generation of pilots who would soon take part in the wider war. But many struggled. They had lost friends, sometimes entire groups of friends. They had lived for months on the edge of survival, bodies exhausted, nerves stretched to breaking, minds full of images they could not forget. The flash of a plane exploding, the sight of a friend descending in flames, the sudden silence when a familiar voice disappeared from the radio. They carried these memories silently, because that was the way of the time. The world praised their courage, but few understood what that courage had cost. Yet the nation honored them. Monuments began to rise in airfields and city squares. Portraits of pilots were displayed in town halls. Their names were read aloud in schools and churches. The phrase Churchill had spoken in Parliament, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," became etched into the identity of a country that knew it had been saved by its sons and by those who had chosen to become its sons. The Spitfire itself became more than a machine. It became an icon of resistance, an elegant masterpiece of engineering that had danced through the sky when Britain needed it most. Children built models of it. Artists painted it. Veterans touched its smooth skin decades later with tears in their eyes, remembering the roar of its engine like the heartbeat of their youth. The legacy of the few grew with each passing year. Museums opened halls dedicated to the Battle of Britain, displaying uniforms, maps, control room equipment, and recovered aircraft parts twisted by battle. Survivors visited these exhibits quietly, sometimes with grandchildren who saw their grandfathers not as warriors, but as gentle old men with stories too big to imagine. Air shows revived the Spitfire and Hurricane, their engines echoing across fields where these aircraft had once risen to defend a nation. On Remembrance Day, wreaths were laid at memorials bearing the names of airmen who never came home, and crowds stood in silence as aircraft traced slow, solemn passes overhead. But the true legacy lived not in museums or ceremonies. It lived in the continued freedom of Britain, and in the fact that democracy survived a moment when it very nearly did not. Had the Luftwaffe succeeded, Hitler's invasion plans would have followed. Britain might have fallen, and with it the hope of resistance in Europe. The few had prevented that future. They had bought the world time, precious time, that allowed the Allies to gather strength, that allowed America to enter the war, that allowed the tide to turn. Their victory did not end the war, but without it, the war might have been lost before it truly began. In the decades that followed, as the pilots aged, their numbers thinned. Reunions grew smaller. Voices that once filled dispersal huts with laughter and bravado grew faint. But those who remained spoke with humility. They did not call themselves heroes. Many insisted they had simply done their duty, that the real heroes were the ones who did not return. They spoke of ground crews who worked through nights repairing aircraft under bombing raids. They spoke of radar operators, WAF plotters, and commanders who orchestrated a defense unlike anything the world had seen. They understood better than anyone that victory was a collective effort, a chain of countless acts of bravery, intelligence, and sacrifice. And so the legacy of the few endures, not as a distant legend, but as a living reminder of what humanity can achieve when freedom is threatened. Every anniversary of the Battle of Britain, Spitfires still take to the sky, their wings catching the sunlight, their engines singing the same fierce song that once echoed across a nation under siege. People stop and look up, just as they did in 1940. Some smile, some cry. All feel the weight of history and the thunder of those engines. The story of Britain's air war in 1940 is ultimately a story of courage, the courage to face overwhelming odds, to stand firm when retreat seemed the only logical choice, to rise into the sky again and again, knowing that each flight might be the last. The few did not fight for glory. They fought because the alternative was unthinkable. They fought because someone had to. And in doing so, they shaped the world. Their legacy will never fade. It lives in the freedom they protected, in the skies they defended, and in the hearts of all who remember them not just as pilots, but as heroes of the sky.